So welcome everybody. My name is Ted. I'm in Western Massachusetts and I live in a co-housing community. I'm also happen to be one of the co-founders of Sociocracy For All. And let's see, what else is there to know about me? Yeah, so I live with 70 neighbors here. We run this co-housing community sociocratically. This was actually started before I arrived here. I've been living here for 10 years, I think, or 9, something like that. So it's been sociocratic for quite a while. The talk I want to give today is something that has been on my mind for a long time, because it's actually a problem that is very fundamental. So really, I have some solutions to the problem that I'm showing, but really more I want to describe the problem well, so I can find people who want to explore that problem with me and really like have some shared language about it, I guess. And I call it the numbers problem. And you will see how this problem actually shows up in many different places. Hold on, looking for my slides. I guess that makes no difference here. And as I said, I want to have this, it's really for me a beginning conversation that I want to have. So if you have anything that you think like, oh, this sounds like something Ted should know, that sounds like the problem he was talking about, or even better, a solution to it, I'd be absolutely psyched to hear about it. So let me first actually say what I'm not going to talk about, or what I'm not going to be stating, I guess. My claim is not that sociocracy doesn't scale. That is not my point. It's actually much more complicated than that. But it sounds like that, you know, if I talk about a sociocracy co-op kind of thing, and I say, yeah, there's a problem in large co-ops that we need to talk about. It's very easy to think that I'm talking about scale, but that's not the issue, and I'll refine that a little bit more. What I will say, however, is a little bit more refined. It is something like this. Cooperatives with many members and few workers need tweaks to be run sociocratically and democratically. And I will explain all of that, but that is basically, I gave you the spoiler now. That is basically what I'm going to be saying. So let me elaborate a little bit just so that we really have full clarity on this. What I'm saying is not a problem. Scale by itself is not a problem. What do I mean by that? So in worker-run organizations, the workers, the members are the decision makers. Everything is easy, right? That is a situation that we have in large groups. So for example, cooperative housing, like the way I live in there, is basically organized like that. Though we're sociocratic, I'll get to that. But basically we're it, right? That's fully self-managed and so on. If we refine it in sociocratic terms, we still have the same situation of, well, the people who do the work here are the same people who are also the members here, are the same people who are the decision makers. So for example, in my cooperative housing, all 70, I never know how many we actually are, something between 70 and 80 or 90 people, counting kids. All of us are some decision makers somewhere to some extent. We're all members, and there are no other members than us, and we're doing all the work that needs to be done. Okay, so there's a perfect match, and that is the situation that sociocracy is perfect for. And I said it a little bit in passing here, and I want to just point out what I mean by that. Everyone is a decision maker somewhere. Because I hope that you're familiar with sociocratic design principles. If not, this might be a little fast. But the point is that this person, for example, is a decision maker in this circle, right? While this person is a decision maker in this circle. So everybody is a decision maker somewhere, and that's actually that word is actually quite a keyword on this whole discussion. Let's see. Now, if we scale this, there is no immediate problem, at least. And by the way, don't get caught up. It's more like an impressionistic kind of way of showing it, right? I didn't actually go bother putting all those 100 dots into a perfect spot. So, but you understand the design principle. I assume if you're familiar with sociocracy, we have small groups that are decision makers in their domain. So for example, if this is the group that organizes snow plowing, they decide how that is being done. If this is the group that is doing the Facebook group, they decide how that is being done. So they are decision maker on that aspect, that domain. And now, if there are many people involved in many different things, that's great. The principle is still the same, right? So for example, if we differentiate a lot and we are now a really complex organization, we might have, where earlier we had like just, let's say, social media group, we now have a group for Facebook and a group for Instagram, and these people do Twitter, what do I know? Something like that. So we basically go more in detail and we cover more ground with more people, more attention. That's what scaling would look like in a sociocratic organization. Next step. Now, what do we do if we have a number of people who are members of an organization that are not workers anywhere? So for example, if we have something like a food co-op, right? Where you might be a member, but it's not that you're restocking things there. Okay. So now we have a situation that gets a little bit more complicated. So now we have members, and this is, then we have people who do the work, and we have, for example, a board that makes decisions. And I know there's a bunch of models here, right? I want to give you the broad strokes so that I can get to my actual point. So typically what happens then, and this is not so Socratic, is that we would have members vote on who, for example, should be on the board, and we would have workers in hybrid models, for example. We might have workers that also vote, or however that's going to be worked out. But you see that the in terms of design, what happens is that we need to distinguish between members and workers and decision makers. Like, it's not as easy as in the original picture where everything is just the same, where we have a perfect match between people who do things, people who make decisions about how things are being done, and members. Once that perfect match between, like, where all of those are the same people, once that goes away, we have to start negotiating between those different groups, basically. Okay. Next step. This is all building on, so I also have to actually go slowly and think my way through it of like, okay, what's the next step? The next step is, how does that look in a sociocratic organization? In a sociocratic organization, you also have the situation that sometimes you have members that are not actually involved. And that is not super common, at least that's not what sociocracy was originally intended for. But it happens actually all the time once you pay attention to it. So, for example, let's look at an easy example, like, let's say this is cooperative housing again, right? So like in my community, where you would have, again, people who are running the Facebook group and the people who are in charge of the snow shoveling and all of that business, and you have those nested circles somehow, like, this is, again, not drawn accurately, but it's the principle here. Then you might have people who are members because they live there and they are, however, whatever that means to that particular organization, they are members, but they are not part of a decision-making circle. So what that looks like is, for example, we have people in my community who are not part of a circle, but they live here and they're members. Now, they might still be doing work and they might still be paying their fees or whatever it is. So they do everything the other members do, except that they're not in a policy making circle. Therefore, they're not technically decision makers. Okay. And again, I say that's not all that unusual. For example, in Sociocracy For All, we're a nonprofit, but still the same principle applies, sociocratic nonprofit. We have, and we're a membership organization. So you might have people who are, for example, supporting members, uh, but they're not in a decision-making circle. So that's where a sociocratic design principles actually break with the pattern that we would have in democratically run organizations, because a sociocratic setup wants the decisions to be made in circles and not by a group of people who are uninvolved. I hope you're following me, because I know this is somewhat abstract stuff. I call these people often worker bees from a sociocratic point of view, because, for example, this person might be shoveling snow, and this person, right, happily so, as members of the community, while these people organize how the snow plowing and the snow shoveling is being organized. And they just say, you guys just, decide, tell me the system and tell me where and when to shovel. I'm happy to do that. So they might be even workers, right? So one could even put this over here. They might be workers if that's what the organization requires, but they are still not decision makers. And from a sociocratic point of view, that's fine with me. Like, you can have people who are somewhat uninvolved that just do their thing and are members, and they're being heard when a circle reaches out for feedback and so on. They know who to go to on a smaller scale. And if this is just a bunch of people compared to these, it's fine. And I actually counted in my community. So I said we're like 70, 80 members. And I think about 20 of them are not in a circle. So this is actually a fairly good representation of how things are run here. Those people seem to be content not being decision makers. They're being heard overall anyway. Well, these people make decisions in their domain. The problem is, what happens if we have 2,000 of these? And that's really the problem I'm talking about. It's that exact problem. So for me, it's not a matter of scale. It's a matter of the ratio between the people who are decision makers in circles and the people who are members in a membership organization, under the assumption that we expect that those people have a say on policy decisions. If you don't need that, then you're good. Then there's no problem. Okay. So now, of course, if one says that, one could easily say, oh, those people could just vote, right? Let's say we have like these people and we want to hear them on the snow shoveling issue, or on something more important, I don't know. Let's say we want to double our membership fee. These people could just vote. And the thing is that sociocracy isn't perfectly compatible with voting, for a bunch of reasons. One of which I'll talk about later, actually, because it has to do with the autonomy of the circle that we actually treasure quite a bit. So how do we represent many of those voices in those circles? That's the question. Okay. So to me, it's not so much a question about numbers, really. That's one aspect of it. But really, it's more about a value clash. And I'll explain that in a moment. And I mean a value clash, sadly, between cooperative or democratic principles and sociocratic principles. And it's, by the way, a little bit ironic, right? Here I am, of one of the co-founders of Sociocracy For All, showing up at this co-op conference saying, oh, by the way, the two of them actually don't mesh all that well. I'm very much aware of the irony of that. But I think it's a really interesting issue. Let's see, what's the next step here? So, as I said, the real problem, or the real interesting thing, is how do we hear the people who are uninvolved, so they're not policy making members of policy making circles, in this kind of setup? One thing that could be easy to do, or basically how sociocracy, the way it was intended, thinks about it, is you could have stakeholder circles. You would have, like, let's say these members then in some way or form determine a representation of 5 people who are then the membership, like the circle that represents the membership, that then feeds the information into the board. Those kind of things exist, and yet we still would need to find out how to get from a lot of people into a stakeholder circle. especially if you want to do without voting. So that would be a representation of what I mean here. So if you somehow feed these people into the, let's say, for example, these two people were links, right? As we do in sociocracy, how would all those people determine what those two links are? I know how to run a selection process with sociocracy with, let's say, 80 people. No, actually, that's also, well, 80 people I could do, I guess. But how do you run it with 2000? I don't know. Okay. We're about halfway or 2/3 in, just so you know. And there will be time to get some responses here, which I'm most excited about. Now let me talk about the voting issue, actually. So now let's say we vote in some form, like we want those 2,000 people, just to put a number on it here. We want those 2,000 people to, let's say, vote somehow into this, like into how this organization is run. The problem with voting, and that's why sociocracy doesn't like doing it in general, the problem with voting is voting rewards the loudest voices. And majority rule also tends to polarize more. Because, for example, if you have now 2,000 people, okay, and we say, oh, one spot on the board is for members, then how do you become that person? It can only be that in some way, out of the 2,000, they somehow, many decide to vote for you. And, then you would have to do certain things that make you stand out of the 2,000. It's not that they even know each other enough, the 2,000, to even base that decision on anything that they actually have immediate knowledge about. If you're familiar with how sociocracy selects people, you know that we actually select people who we know based on qualifications and our experience with those people and how they meet those. For example, if I select somebody to be the delegate to the next higher circle, I would select somebody who I trust in how they are able to represent other people's opinions on that next higher circle. But with 2,000 people, how would I know how that person shows up as a delegate for the membership? So vote. That's why we have this issue around voting. And also, actually, there's another aspect to that. So let's say, as I said earlier, we have like some sort of stakeholder representation. Let's say 2 seats on the mission circle, which is like the counterpart to a board, more or less, more like an advisory board, really. Let's say this were done by majority vote. Okay, so we say, okay, the 2,000 members or 10,000, 100,000, if we think about cooperatively owned Twitter, for example, right? Something like that, we would have a lot of people. So we would probably resort to majority vote and vote for those 2 people. With all the downsides that majority vote already brings with loudest voices and so on. But let's say we do it anyway. There's still one issue, and that is that in sociocratic principles, it is actually quite deeply embedded that these 4 people would need to have consent rights to receive those 2 people on the circle. You cannot just push somebody into a working group. Membership of a circle happens by consent in a sociocratic system. And that's actually a principle that I hold quite dearly because I'm just so painfully aware of how key it is to a group to be functioning well together, to have choice for each other. Because if, let's imagine the sort of the worst case that could actually happen fairly easily. The 2,000 people want to vote one person goes all out and campaigns, and spends some money in campaigning. We all know what that looks like, right? So this person campaigns because, and what would be driving them? They might be very opinionated about how things should be done. So they campaign and they convince many people and they're like polarizing to get that seat. And now they're in that seat. Would those 4 people actually want to work with that person? I have some doubts about that. So that shows you some of the things that we, just by the pure nature of how we organize, that we would set ourselves up for. But what would happen if these 4 people now object and say, no, we don't want to work with that person. We don't want that person to have consent rights on what we do overall here on our mission circle. That's risky. So I'm telling you again, I'm telling you the problem. I don't have a perfect solution to this. I just want to basically give an accurate, in my like to best of my knowledge and my understanding, an accurate description of the problems that we're facing when we mix those two worlds and add scale. As I said, small scale, sociocracy and democratic organizing mesh perfectly. Not really an issue that I see. Once you scale and have this mismatch, then those gaps basically break open and then they become actual issues. Let's see, where am I? Hold on. Yeah, so we basically would take away these people's consent if we fill those two seat on by majority vote. So the meshing of democratic and sociocratic values would be perfectly possible if a cooperative is willing to let go of representation by voting on the board. And it would be perfectly solvable if sociocratic organizations would be willing to let go of wanting to have consent rights on like consent rights by the mission circle members to new members on the mission circle. Yet both of these principles are very deeply embedded in the ideology and the value set of those two groups. So that's not an easy one. I noticed for myself that I'm, coming from the sociocratic side, I'm more willing to go like, this we could get let go of, right? While here, I feel myself being a little bit more rigid of like, no, this is actually something I'm not willing to give up. And I'm sure that at least half of you feel exactly opposite. So that shows us that we actually probably have strong feelings about that. I'm projecting from my level of how opinionated I feel myself being about that, projecting that there might be people on the other side. Okay. Let's see, what's the next step? Now, some things that can take the edge off, in my view. One is I want to say a few words about feedback, because feedback sounds like it's a small thing, right? Oh, you don't have real power. All you can do is feedback. And yet, from a sociocratic point of view, feedback is a lot, because information is a lot and we want to set up things so that we can hear each other well. So feedback, if it's well given and well received, is a real superpower. And we we rely a lot on trusting feedback mechanism overall, just again, as a design principle. So for example, here, this shows you the little graphic from a book here, Many Voices, One Song, that I know many people like. So you see how information flows here through the circle. So what this shows us actually, so you would have a general circle. This might be the mission circle. You would have a double linked circle here, double linked circle here. And double linking, for those of you unfamiliar with sociocracy, means that one person from this circle is also a full member of this circle and vice versa. So those people are members of this circle and of that circle. And that's how we connect circles, right, in our nesting system here, which means this person now will be able to carry information from here to here, and this person will be able to carry information here to here. And that's how ideally information flows through the whole organization. And you can imagine, if you think for a moment here, if we had subcircles here, we would just expand that chain, right? So the chain is really always unbroken. And I like the image of, if you imagine that these were all people holding hands, the way the dotted line is right now. If you on your mind think about all of them stepping back, stepping back, stepping back, we would have a big circle. Can you see that? So that's the mindset that sociocracy is coming from, right? Everybody is a decision maker here in one of those circles, and information flows, and we're really all on the same level, and we just happen to pinch in here those circles, so that, because in a group of 100 people, it's really hard to make decisions. So we pinch it into smaller circles so that those people can actually hear and know each other and build expertise on the domain that they're working on together. So now information in the form of feedback can basically flow into this, like almost like the nervous system, right? You feed information in, and then it will be amplified, and it will be filtered, and it will be passed on, and somehow transformed into something that can feed into action. So that's the overall idea on feedback. Now, of course, these people give each other feedback and so on. So information and feedback is supposedly flowing as as much as it can. Now let me refine this whole feedback thing, because I'm also aware that stray information in a stray circle isn't always the most successful, right? If you are part of an organization, you might know that if you are in your spot, right? Like, let's say I'm sitting here and somebody gives me randomly random seeming information, it's really hard to know what to do with that now. So you can't just feed information into an organization. It's not that simple. So that needs a little bit of design. And when I was thinking about how to connect what I call the many with the decision-making, policy-making circles, what really needs to happen is that we have spaces of co-creation, right? So we have a space, for example, here you might be discussing racial justice, right? Because this circle wants that information and polls or surveys or invites all the members and say, hey, we want to have your input on this thing. It could be a forum, for example, right? Or it could be a conference. It could be all kinds of things. And then on different issues, you could have different spaces where that information is digested. So that's how on certain issues that you basically create an interface for, you can hear a lot of people. It's really hard to hear 2,000 people on every issue, right? You would have to pick and choose of like, oh, this is a great question for members to get some input. Hold on, where am I here? Right. And another thing is that circles by themselves need to create clean interfaces, right? If this is, for example, the social media circle and they want input on whether their campaign is working for people, they can, of course, create an interface, like basically something, for example, like an email, like give us feedback, email address. So there could be information here just on that question. And then depending, like any circle individually can do that, right? Create like this opening, like I sometimes think of as a mailbox. Like each circle basically needs their mailbox to receive information from the membership at large. So now we've basically talked about three different summary thing here, three different ways of harvesting feedback or voting people or however, in whatever way, having people on the mission circle representing, so that here they can determine whatever our overall mission is and where we're headed as an organization. That's where one can hear. You can hear on particular issues, and you can hear on more operational things like, hey, I think, you should be doing this, and how about you offer a conference or something like that, like idea inbox. So those are three different ways that I see how an organization that is fully differentiated here and is doing their own thing, how they can interact with a larger membership. And I find all of them interesting, and actually, if I look at that, to be honest, I'm more interested in these things than I am in this. That's just me personally speaking. I'm more interested in co-creation and thinking about that, knowing that it means giving up or at least not prioritizing as highly the whole thing of representation on the board. That's not something I find exciting. I find this exciting and this exciting. Let's see. So those are the three design ideas. By the way, there's one little hybrid for those of you who are deep into sociocracy. I was thinking that one could basically do a setup where one would have by majority vote people nominated, right? And then give the mission circle the choice to consent to select a person from the people that got nominated by majority vote and select them by consent. So I can think of hybrid versions. All of these are interesting design questions to me. Now there's a tiny little plot twist that I want to add. And that is that I would think this is not really about anything deeply sociocratic or even cooperative, as in democratic places and organizations, because I guess any organization should have those interfaces in place, right? And they already do, actually, as a matter of fact, right? Many organizations interact with their users, for example, on certain platforms, right? And any customer support and so on is basically like that direct conversation. So it's not something unique, actually. And that brings me to the next question of, hold on, if we're there, why would we even, like, what's the difference between members and just any person that wants to interact with the organization? So that's actually an open question to me. Now, why does this matter to me? To me, this is not an intellectual exercise. That too, it is actually a very interesting intellectual exercise, but that's not the point. My point is that we better figure this out pretty quickly, because I need that the same problem comes up in large organizations that have membership for whatever reason. It also, so for example, platform co-ops. That's why I first really noticed that as an issue. Platform co-ops, if they want to run, they have, or if they want to run sociocratically, they immediately run into that very issue. But also, any kind of stakeholder representation in sociocracy needs to figure that out, because stakeholders can be many people, not only members. It could also be donors or whatever. But now if we go, for example, to how do we represent a town, right? What do we do with the many? If we ran a town sociocratically, you don't need 80,000 people to run an 80,000 people town. So what's that relationship between the people who run things and the people who just live there? They're basically members of the town, right? And then I'm involved in bioregional organizing. So the problem comes there up again. And then people always ask me, could one run a country sociocratically? And I said, I don't know, because I know that's at the heart of it. That is the problem. And I would really like to figure it out. So to me, the whole problem on a very abstract level becomes about how do we wed sociocratic design principles, small groups, membership based on consent, decisions like based on trust, basically, and choice. How do we wed that with listening at scale, which, by the way, is a thing, listening at scale, because there have been experiments, for example, in Taiwan, on how to do that, but not with sociocracy, with other principles. But I'm very curious about that in general. So it's this interface, the many and the few, basically, that interests me the most. So if you have any idea that would get me somewhere, I'd be totally happy to hear that. And my email address, if I don't wiggle, then it is here in the slide.